Taking my money, just throwing it away. Look at your palm, gonna need it someday. Better hold to your money. Better hold to your money. Better hold to your money, cause you won't need it someday.
In prior installments on this playlist, we discussed how the church's position toward usury has changed. We discussed how that the church had always declared that it is a mortal sin to take any interest on a loan whatsoever. We discussed how the Catholic Encyclopedia tried to explain away this change by saying, the vehement denunciation of the fathers of the 4th and 5th centuries were called forth by the moral decadence and avarice of the time, and we cannot find in them any expression of a general doctrine on this point. In the last installment, we looked at the writings of many of the early church fathers, and we saw a general condemnation of usury, and there seemed that there was an expression of a general doctrine at that point. Also in the last installment, we read a quote by St. Gregory of Nyssa. St. Gregory of Nyssa was the younger brother of St. Basil the Great, and today we're looking at St. Basil's homily on usury. St. Basil was one of 10 children. 3 of those children, including St. Basil and St. Gregory, became bishops, and 4 of the children were canonized as saints. St. Basil's father and mother and grandmother were also saints. And how awesome is all that? St. Basil tells us, it is the last pitch of inhumanity that one man in need of the bare necessities of life should be compelled to borrow, and another, not satisfied with the principle, should seek to make gain and profit for himself out of the calamities of the poor. So how is the situation that St. Basil is describing any different from what we have today? Lenders still aren't happy with just getting back the principal. They still seek to gain profit on the interest of their loans. But what of the money lover, meaning the usurer? He sees before him a man under the stress of necessity, bent to the ground in supplication. He sees him humiliated. He sees him suffering undeserved misfortune. But he, the usurer, is merciless. He does not reckon that the borrower is his fellow creature. He stands stiff and sour. According to the FDIC, America's banks made $164.8 billion in profits in 2017. He, meaning the user, backs lies with oaths and makes a poor addition to his stock and trade by supplementing inhumanity with perjury. However, I shall certainly take something off and give it to you on better terms, says the user. And with pretenses of this kind and talk like this, he fawns on the wretched victim and induces him to swallow the bait. Then he binds him with written security, adds loss of liberty to the trouble of his pressing poverty, and he's off. The man who has made himself responsible for interest, which he cannot pay, has accepted voluntary slavery for life. So the concept of debt slavery is not a new one. St. Basil set forth the concept back in the early 4th century. And what St. Basil is saying is consistent with what we read from the rest of the church fathers in the last installment. But what does the world and the status quo have to say about this? According to rationalwiki.org, debt slavery cranks will sometimes work a good deal of a religion into their conspiracy theories, invoking the Bible's restrictions on usury. Some of the more moonbatty types will advocate the abolition of international finance so that we may return to the way things were before the rise of the banksters. Was St. Basil the Great a crank, or was he moonbatty? Or maybe the problem is that the world has lost its way. Tell me, do you expect to get money and profit out of the pauper? He came seeking an ally, and he found a foe. He was looking for medicine, and he came upon poison. You ought to have comforted him in his distress, but in your attempt to grow fruit on waste, you're aggravating his necessity. Just as well might a physician go to his patients, and instead of restoring them to health, rob them of the little strength that they might have left. This is the way that you try to profit from the misery of the wretched. Just as farmers pray for rain to make their fields fatter, you're anxious for men's need and indigence, so that your money might make more. You forget that the addition which you are making to your sins is larger than the increase to your wealth, which you are reckoning on getting for your usury. Now that usurers have pretty much saturated the market for home loans, they're looking to find new areas from which they can profit. The average student loan for the class of 2017 graduates was $39,400. That's up 6% from the previous year. The lender runs like a hound after the game, The borrower, like a ready prey, crouches at the coming catastrophe, for his destitution robs him of the power of speech. While the one is congratulating himself as the interest mounts up, the other is groaning at the growth of his calamities. Since the early 1980s, my wife and I have purchased 3 houses, but actually we never really purchased the houses. The bank always owned them. We were only allowed to live in them just as long as we paid a monthly payment, which involved a scam called amortized interest, which we'll talk about more in a future installment. But anyways, of these 3 houses, for 2 of them, before we bought the houses, the previous owners had lost the homes due to foreclosure. For the 3rd home, the one that we live in now, it was a flipped house, but the house flipper was able to purchase the house cheaply because the previous owner had lost his job and was forced to sell before he lost the home due to foreclosure. What you, a user, are taking involves the last extremity of inhumanity. You are making your profit out of misfortune. You are levying a tax upon tears. You are strangling the naked. You are dealing blows on the starving. There is no pity anywhere, no sense of your kinship to the hungry. And you call the profit you get from these sources kindly inhumane. There were foreclosure filings on 676,535 U.S. properties in 2017. But in 2010, there were over 2.8 million foreclosure filings. You plant where there is no ground. You reap where there has been no sowing. For whom you are gathering, you cannot tell. The man from whom usury wrings tears is clear enough, but it's doubtful who is destined to enjoy the results of your superfluity. You have laid up in store for yourself the trouble that results from your iniquity, but it is uncertain whether you will not leave the use of your wealth to others. If any wealthy man in this town promises you repayment on behalf of others, do you admit his suretyship? But you do not accept that of God's, who more than repays on behalf of the poor. Give the money lying useless, without weighting it with increase, and both shall be benefited. To you will accrue the security of its safekeeping. The recipients will have the advantage of its use. And if it is increased which you seek, be satisfied with that which is given by the Lord. He will pay the interest for the poor. Await the loving kindness of him who is truth most kind. There is sort of a myth that the interest from loans is reinvested into the economy. However, the fact is that much of the interest paid on loans goes straight to the pockets of the users. United States banks paid $121.4 billion in dividends in 2017. That's money that went straight back to the bankers. That's the most since the FDIC started keeping track in 1984, and it's most likely the most in history. Woe unto them that call inhumanity humanity. There are such people as 12% men and 10% men. They're exactors by the month, like the demons who produce epilepsy. So nowadays, the Catholic Church tells us that usury is charging an unreasonable amount of interest. Here, St. Basil seems to be saying that loans of 10 or 12% are unconscionable and are unreasonable. When my wife and I got our loan for our first house, it was for 10% interest. That was back in the early 1980s. And at that time, that was considered an extremely good interest rate. People complimented us on it. So is taking 10% interest by a bank considered usury, even using the modern definition? Is what St. Basil wrote applicable to our times? According to the Catholic Encyclopedia, the Church Fathers only spoke against usury due to the moral decadence and avarice of the time. I submit to you that the moral decadence and avarice of our time outstrips anything that took place in St. Basil's time. Well, thank you for watching this video. I'll be back again in about a week with another one, but in the meantime, please check out my Facebook page, which is linked down below. Every day I post additional content that you won't find on this YouTube channel, and please pray for the church.
The percentage you're paying is too high priced while you're